Welcome to everybody joining us today, and we're just about ready to start. I think we have a few people trickling in, so maybe just hold for just a few seconds more, and then Armando, I'll turn it over to you to get us started. Yeah, I think Armando, we can get going now. Let's start ourselves going today. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, bon après-midi tout le monde. My name is Armando Perla, and I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. Before I started, I just want to start by acknowledging that I am connecting today from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. I also want to acknowledge that I first arrived on this part of the continent, Turtle Island, 23 years ago, fleeing homophobia from the remains of as well the colonial violence that is still plaguing the country where I was born. I arrived on Treaty 1 land territory in the heartland of the Métis Nation in what's now known as Winnipeg as well. And that's where I actually met Pauline and Heather. So today we are here because we're going to be talking about, again, the ethics of oral history. And I could not think of better speakers to actually ask to join us than both Pauline and Heather. I met these two amazing women right at the beginning of my career in the museum sector about 13 years ago when we, the three of us, were actually being part of developing the newest national museum in this country, which was the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. A very challenging project, to say the least. But I do remember all those conversations that we had around the ethics of oral history. So these are conversations that we've been having for over a decade. And, you know, it is still quite amazing that today we're here still talking about the same issues. But also I think it shows the importance of continuing to have these conversations in our sector, because one of the things that we discussed back then at the beginning, you know, of the development of that oral history collection for the Human Rights Museum was how can we ensure that we are not going to continue to re-traumatize people that have experienced such sometimes horrid human rights, you know, violations, or also how are we not going to just sort of make poster childs, right, of these people as well, how we're not going to tokenize these people. So those were just some of the many conversations that we had in relation to the ethics of oral history, but we really wanted to put front and center the minimization of harm as one of those principles, right? And something that we also kind of discovered back then is that there were no guidelines, ethical guidelines to conduct oral history for museum professionals. There are guidelines, of course, in, you know, ethics boards and committees at universities in the academic realm, but we do not have anything like that in the museum world. I moved to Sweden after working at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and we also did similar work there and a lot of research around not only in Sweden, but also internationally, trying to find examples of ethical guidelines. And we couldn't find any. We couldn't find anything as well in the International Council of Museums Code of Ethics, which is also why I became part of the International Committee on Ethical Dilemmas at ICOM, trying to find, you know, those ethical guidelines. And I'm still in search for that, which is why, you know, we are, like I said, starting these conversations here now in Ontario and Toronto. And we are so delighted to, again, hear from Pauline and from Heather and to tell us about their own experiences as well, working both, you know, in oral history at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, but also how they've continued to do this work outside and after they ended their time at the museum as well. So I think with that, I will end. And just to say, I'm extremely excited about this. And thank you, both of you, for accepting this invitation as well.
Great, I'm going to hope that the technology gods are with us here. And hopefully everybody sees our PowerPoint presentation. I'd like to start by saying thank you, Armando and the Ontario Museums Association for inviting us. We would like to start off by just by centering ourselves a little bit and locating ourselves. So my name's Heather Bidzinski, and I am a non-Indigenous archivist who's grateful to work and live on the lands of the Anishinaabe, the Innu, the Nopaming Innuwag, the Dakota, the Denisoline peoples, the Inuit, and we're working in the homeland of the Métis Nation right now. I've been practicing in the world of archives and museums for over 15 years, and my journey in the past 10 years especially has been increasingly dedicated to practicing unsettled archivy. So working with oral history and the oral history program at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights allowed me to begin exploring the ways in which we can all work together and bringing different ways of knowing and being into one harmonious perspective. Along the way, I've had really amazing opportunities to work with colleagues from the East Coast all the way to the West. And before coming to the University of Manitoba, I was head of collections at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, where I had the privilege of working with wonderful people like Armando and my co-presenter and friend, Pauline Tennent. Over to you, Pauline.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you again for having me. It's lovely to see Armando and to be invited by Heather. And I wanted to also start by locating myself. I am a settler, an immigrant, a mum, a very sleep-deprived mum with 2 kids, one of which is trying to kill me slowly. And I am a researcher, and it is with all these hats that I come to this topic and this conversation today. I have worked in and with qualitative and community-based research now for about 15 years, including time at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and then later on at the University of Manitoba. And my work over the years has involved oral history, but also qualitative interviews, arts-based methodologies, so digital storytelling, photo voice, body mapping, and then looking at how we create publications, exhibits, animation products, film from that research. And I've been really privileged in the work that I've been able to do. I've worked by and large with communities who could be considered sort of systematically oppressed or marginalized. And this over the years has included asylum seekers facing deportation, refugees, young workers, youth aging out of the care system, youth with health crises and mental health crises, and as well as human rights activists and advocates. And I was trying to think in preparation for this presentation about maybe how many interviews I've sort of done over the years. And I think it's probably about 50 oral histories, some as long as about 7 hours, and probably about 500 qualitative interviews. And I think that sort of regardless of the type of method that we used or that the community that I was working with, the main idea was that I was working in research that was aiming to advance issues of social justice.
So we've tried to lay out in broad strokes some of the objectives of our presentation today, and we're going to try to cover everything from knowledge and research methodologies to managing the products of an oral history project. And we will be speaking from a place of personal experience in our professional lives. Recognizing that everybody's experiences will be different, we hope to touch on some familiar themes. And ethical approaches are going to be sort of the common thread that hopefully ties this all together for us. Our practical examples will come from our shared experience at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, as well as life after the CMHR. We'll talk about the origins of the oral history program at the CMHR and the challenges we experienced while building both the program and the collection. We will also touch on the importance of good documentation. I am, after all, an archivist, and informed consent, and what to do with all the products you'll be creating in the oral history process. It's a lot, but we do promise that we will leave room for questions at the end. Over to you, Pauline.
Thank you, Heather. So part of my role here today is just to get us thinking about oral history, to get us thinking about ethics, but I wanted to also take a step back and look at knowledge, to look at research and to recognize that oral history can be used as a tool for democratizing the research process, for democratizing history, but that's not necessarily the case. Research, the production of knowledge, the co-creation, the sharing, it's this dynamic process. It's built into and it's dependent on our social relations, and it can be used as a tool for transformation, but research can also be used to maintain the status quo. As Heather mentioned, we are coming to you today from Treaty 1 territory. Our water is sourced from Shoal Lake 40. Our hydroelectricity comes from Treaty 5 territory in northern Manitoba. And we are acknowledging this land in which we live, in which we work, as an attempt to begin to grapple with the fact that we are living and working in a settler, colonial, and neoliberal context, and that this is inextricably linked to the research that we do. Institutions, be they museums or universities, continue to be complicit partners in the settler colonial context. Research has been directly implicated in the violence of colonization, and across disciplines and academic fields, research continues to be imbued with power and hierarchies. Traditionally, researchers have had the ultimate control over the design of the research, the collection of data, the interpretation of its results, and that's led many to call it terra nullius research. It has also been directly linked to processes of othering, speaking for and of the other. And yet throughout history, the other, and I'm using sort of air quotes there, navigates, negotiates, and resists these processes. And so as Linda Tuhiwai-Smith comments, research will always be a significant site of struggle between the interests and ways of knowing of the West and the interests and ways of resisting of the other. And so while we can see this changing research landscape, including a movement towards more participatory and community-based research, the development of research ethic boards and protocols, this is not to say that the question of the responsibility and accountability of the researcher is adequately addressed in research, nor that institutions have caught up to that conversation. So because of that, I'm influenced and inspired by research and research methods that are anti-colonial, that are disruptive, and that are unsettling. And specifically, it's proactive against the violence, the practice, and the ideology of colonialism. It's foregrounding, valuing, and reclaiming, and making space for voices, ontologies, and epistemologies that have been previously excluded. It's tackling the privileging and the normalization of whiteness. It's incorporating lived and living experience and narrative, and it's locating oneself, because I think it's through locating oneself that we can begin to build trust with those with whom we work. We can inform research participants of our own relatedness, and we can be accountable in the research process. And if you could go to the next slide. So again, before we move into oral history, I just wanted to very briefly touch on research paradigms. So the qualitative researchers Egon Guba and Yvonne Lincoln state, no inquirer ought to go about the business of inquiry without being clear about just what paradigm informs and guides his or her approach. So what's a research paradigm? Cree scholar Sean Wilson describes it as the set of beliefs about the world and about gaining knowledge. It guides all of the actions as a researcher. I'm not going to go into this in great depth. There's some amazing scholars out there, Michael Hart, Sean Wilson, Margaret Kovach, for examples, are just some of the many who look at these research paradigms. And it's including the basic beliefs that we have, the assumptions we hold, and the principles that we have that are guiding this research process. All research paradigms are comprised of interrelated elements. And so this includes ontology, epistemology, methodology, and also axiology. So with ontology, we're looking at our way of being in the world. It's what you believe to be real. And so with ontology, you're sort of asking, what is there to study? If you're looking at the nature of what you believe to be real, then flows epistemology, and it's how you think of that reality. With epistemology, we are asking, what do we know, and how do we come to know it? Methodology is another key aspect. And so while this narrow approach would focus just on the methods or the tools that you might use, it also must include the theory that guides how you selected those tools and how those tools will be used in the process. And here I also wanted to acknowledge that traditionally research methods have been extractive in nature. And so you have this idea of researchers parachuting in to a community, a space, a place, taking whatever data they felt was necessary, and then leaving given nothing in return. So they don't provide information about how the data will be used. And this data is so often, in many cases with qualitative research especially, this is the stories that are being told. It's the life that has been shared, the observations made, and the knowledge that is generated, and nothing is given back to the community or told about how that data would be used. And from that, we also have axiology. So axiology refers to the moral and ethical values that infuse all aspects of a research paradigm. It's about the ethics of research, but rather than just looking at the ethical guidelines that might govern your work from an institutional perspective, it's about the moral and ethical imperatives that infuse our work. It goes beyond these ethical standards because in reality, as Tuck and Yang have commented, they do not always do enough to ensure that social science research is deeply ethical, meaningful, or useful for the individual or the community being researched. It includes elements of respect and reciprocity, as well as responsibility and accountability. And it's this notion of ethics, of axiology, that is key in oral history. And it demands that we ask ourselves the question, does this research work for the community? If you could go to the next slide, please, Heather. Thank you. This is an infographic that comes from the Working in Good Ways initiative through the University of Manitoba. And there's many similar projects out there, but the resources that come along with this are really fantastic and can be found on the University of Manitoba's website. And it really is about this axiology, about good ways to work with communities. It was based on different Indigenous peoples from around the world worked together in a working group and came up with this framework and also practical guides on how to engage with communities. And it places the onus on the researcher for taking the time and resources also to cultivate genuine trusting and respectful relationships. And one of the really important parts of this is that it highlights that even after the research ends, the relationship does not. And so it demands that we as researchers commit to an ongoing lived commitment to support Indigenous communities in this example, in their struggles for resurgence, for self-determination and sovereignty, but it also demands that we look at relational accountability. And so with this foundation in place, I really am excited to talk about oral history. Of all of the research methods I've been involved in, I think I can say that oral history for me is probably the most humbling experiences. There's something really powerful and really intimate, despite it being this public history approach as well. But to know that someone is entrusting you with their story, with sharing their story with you. And I think that's why I always come back to axiology here. And so what is oral history? These two quotes here are from oral historians whose work has really influenced me. And I won't read them out. But I guess where oral history for me matters is that we know that the broad range of approaches in contemporary research all draw from the same narrow foundation of knowledge that is the social, historical, and cultural experiences of white men. And so that's a quote from anti-racist scholars Leslie Brown and Susan Strega. And so the result is that people who are excluded from positions of power and privilege are relegated to positions of objects of research, at times subjects, but rarely as the authors. So oral history offers this really important opportunity to challenge this privileging, to challenge the normalization of whiteness, to make spaces for those who have been ignored or silenced or misrepresented. But it's not a given. It demands deliberate work on the part of the researcher who plays this sort of pivotal role between the story, the institution, the audience, the individual, to navigate spaces and relationships. As a specific method, it dates back to the 1940s to a researcher at Columbia University. And Columbia University's website on oral history has one of the largest collections and is a really great resource. And so from the 1940s to the 1960s, you start to see historians conducting oral history with everyday people as an approach to creating this idea of history from below. It's a method, it's a practice, it's a theory. And while it emerged in history, it now has crosses disciplines and contexts. With oral history, you're asking individuals to talk about their lives, their experiences, their memories through interviews. And a key part of that is that people are the experts in their own lives. So your interviews might take a variety of formats. They could be life histories, they could be supplemented with, or they could be a thematic approach to the interview. Or you could use tools such as photos or maps or film to then raise questions and ask different questions about someone's life experience. Each different type of interview then requires different work on the part of the interviewer to create or to guide the conversation, to create an interview guide, I should say, or to guide the conversation. And so in exploring people's memories, the stories they tell, their experiences, you're looking at them as eyewitnesses. And in this way, they can fill in the gaps in documented history, but sometimes even correct or contradict it. It's almost like an approach to a grassroots history, and it has the chance to focus on themes that are less likely to be recorded in the public record. Elements of life that we may consider mundane, but that are actually crucial, looking at friendships, at intimacy, at relationships, family life. And it also allows for the recording of voice, of language, of dialect, of accent, of vernacular, and the emotion that comes with it. The reliance on memory in oral history has been critiqued from a variety of disciplines, stating that such approach makes them susceptible both to misinformation and manipulation. And in fact, the early years of the discipline was mainly oral historians sort of responding to those critiques. Italian oral historian Alessandro Portelli, whose quote I have there, he actually highlights that as its strength. He talks about the way that oral history allows us to gain information and to learn stories from individuals and communities that may lack written language. And it opens up spaces in which they can comment upon their experiences. And thus we can gain this wider experience of the human condition. Portelli also argues, in fact, that oral history methods produce more accurate data since they have the opportunity to preserve important forms of communication, not typically documented in archival sources. And also, I just wanted to say too, the idea that oral history can be manipulated is not unique to the method. Any practice related to inquiry and related to history, whether it's based on archival research or oral sources, can be compromised by individual agendas. Nigerian novelist Chinwe Achebe states, "Until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter." The next slide, Heather, if possible. You can probably see a theme here that I love memes. Oral historians have went on to now sort of emphasize the uniqueness of the method and this reliance on memory and subjectivity to show that these are in fact strengths, and that it opens up a means of understanding the truths that others hold. Oral history also relies on this collaborative relationship between the researcher and the narrator. And the product that comes from it, and product I mean in a very general sense, is one that's co-created. So even though the process may be guided by the researcher, it's equally led by the narrator, who may choose how to answer a question, which answers to refuse, or to answer just in a way that they want to. And this refusal, I think, is actually a really important part of oral history that's often not talked about. And it also involves narrators remembering, speaking, listening, but it's determined by the context in which it takes place. And while the interview itself is often held up as the key aspect of oral history, as Schoeps calls it, the sexy part of the method, the preparation for the interview, the time to generate and to cultivate relationships, the time for developing even the interview guide, for field notes, for reflection, for transcription, for sending your transcripts back to the narrator. All of these things are part of oral history and a part that we shouldn't forget in focusing on the interview. So when I think back to oral history, my own experience with it came not as an interviewer, but actually when I accompanied my gran, who was invited to participate in a research project. I was a teenager at the time. And there's many complexities to the actual content, the issue that was being researched. It was looking at housing estates in Scotland and women's activism in pushing for change on those housing estates. But when I reflect on it now, I see some of the tensions in oral history that I deal with when I'm using the methods even today. It was never termed as oral history. My gran and I never spoke of it that way. And I'm not sure that she understood what was being involved when she agreed to take part. And that's not a judgment on the researcher's ability. It's just, I don't think we could have captured or grasped what was meant. I watched her get ready in the morning, and she was stressed about what to wear. And she was stressed that she would have nothing important to say to these uni students, as she called them, even though they were researchers. But this raised really important questions about the barriers and about her position vis-a-vis the researcher. She was worried about issues of class, about having no formal education. And I watched her smoke multiple cigarettes before she went inside. And I'm pretty sure she continued to smoke them when we were inside. And as we sat around the table and we had tea and she went over the consent form, she started to loosen up a little bit. And I admit to this day, I think those conversations with tea and shared meals before or after an oral history are some of the most powerful, and often where the stories shared, you often don't catch them then in the recorded interview. When my gran was asked about her activism in the tenements, I saw her recoil. Her immediate response was, "I'm not an activist." She was adamant that she not be considered as such. And so it raises a really crucial question. What do we as interviewers do when the voices of our narrators do not align with the story we have in mind to tell? I watched changes in my gran the minute the audio recorder was turned on. As an interviewer, I'm not sure that the interviewer would have saw those changes, but I saw her shift in her seat, change her posture. I saw her accent, that thick Glaswegian dialect, I saw it change. And I often wonder, had the researchers who had just met her, would they have captured those changes? This is not to say that there are benefits, or this is also to sort of acknowledge that there's benefits to coming to things from an outsider perspective. But as an insider, I was able to witness those changes in my gran. And even in the most participatory of research relationships, there's issues of power that we need to take into account. We need to look at what we bring to the table, and that can be even the most mundane of moments of daily life, what we wear to the interview, where the interview takes place, the presence of other people in the room, even if they're behind the scenes. I remember interviewing a 70-year-old woman. She was a civil rights activist from a conflict zone, and she brought along her adult daughter to the interview. She had stated that her daughter knew everything there was to know about her, and that she would hear it anyway when the oral history was complete. And yet, right before we clicked record, she asked her daughter to leave the room. There is something really private in the telling, in that immediacy of telling the story, And so I think it's just good to think of oral history in layers. The first layer being the telling of the narrative. In a museum setting, the second layer might be the interpretation of that narrative, the creation of the exhibit, and then the final layer, the audience who views it. I think it's really amazing in an oral history encounter to look not only at what is said, but how it's said. There's moments where a participant pauses, where you catch them looking out a window, where you catch them deep in thought, even if only momentarily, where the hairs on your arms raise. It's the intimacy of what's being shared. And I think that's why it's really important to make really detailed field notes that then your archivist can work on later, to capture those nonverbal cues, to look at, but to also reflect on your own role in the interview of what you could have done differently and how you impacted the telling of the story. I've also participated in oral history interviews that have become really performative. The oral history program at the CMHR initially began with the Champions Project, which was participants who by and large were sort of well-versed in the media. Many of them had been interviewed in the past, had media experience, and so they were responding to questions in a somewhat rote way, a very professional response. And yet sometimes you could catch them off guard with those unexpected questions that broke that performance. And so thinking of my gran, I benefited from that insider perspective. But there's also a benefit when you don't have those inside connections, when there's a distance between yourself and the interviewee, because it allows you to ask questions that maybe you couldn't otherwise. It allows you to feign ignorance and ask for better explanations, better not on the participant's part, but just better in that it allows you to understand. But oral history also asks that we engage in deep listening, engaging not only with the words being spoken, but with the meaning. And I think overall, oral histories can be really energizing in a research process, but they can also be incredibly draining. And I think it's good that you take time as an interviewer. But there are times when these are stories of pain and suffering that raises the challenge of how do we engage in deep listening in response to stories of human crises? And can we adequately respond or ask questions to stories of trauma? Is it even ethical to ask those questions and follow up? And how can we put into words those situations that actually have no words? As Armando spoke about, there's a risk of trauma that can occur when you're asking people to tell and retell their story under a different gaze. Now, I want to be careful. I'm not suggesting that people are void of agency, but when you conduct oral history interviews, at least in a university setting, any type of research in a university setting, you have to outline what you will do in situations where there may be risks of re-traumatization. And often that's meant, you know, in my own work, we work with the mental health organization to offer supports. We have knowledge keepers, elders on hand that participants can reach out to. And I'm not sure that in my experience at museums, those supports have been offered to participants in the same way. There's also challenges that come, and I'm almost done, when the interviewer or the narrator presents views that you as a researcher find unsavory or disagreeable. And I have been in oral history interviews where I fundamentally disagree with what's being said. And so how do you respond? And what does shared authority mean in those contexts? In contexts that are highly politicized, when myths or stereotypes are being shared? Can oral histories democratize history in that sense? And in senses where it is very highly politicized, and so it requires that you as a researcher take more authority, how does shared authority then work? And I just wanted to end by also saying it's really important to problematize notions of community, to also keep in mind who is stepping forward to speak and who is still not being heard, and to look at the gatekeepers and their roles. So oral history at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. I started at the Museum for Human Rights in 2010. And at that point, the museum, and I wonder, Heather, if you could switch to the next slide, please. The museum did not have a research team. We were Armando and I were among the first research team on board. And I mean, I think we've all sort of seen some of the major challenges that have happened at the museum in the past. And those were definitely there at that time. But there was deep concerns also about the development of content at this Ideas Museum, as it was termed. The institution as a whole and its structures and systems had the most narrow of research paradigms, if any at all. And when I think back to those slides that we presented earlier, it essentially privileged the knowledge of old white men. And this was completely at odds with the research team. The institution relied on this notion of being an ideas museum. So it was not necessarily focused on collecting in the traditional sense, but it was also not particularly interested in collecting original research. In this way, it confused public engagement with research, and marketing and communications department held a lot of sway at the institution. The museum also confused and conflated human rights with humanitarianism. And so this preference for stories that were feel good often depoliticized human rights, and instead they preferred stories of Canadian charity. The research team, however, was eager to make connections, to engage in scholarly practice, and to have research that reflected actual human rights. And so for that, oral history was seen as a method that could fulfill the exhibition and programming needs, that could help meet the institution's collections and operating mandates. But also for the research team, I think it was this way to live human rights, to make spaces for voices that had been deliberately silenced or unheard. And I think it's very fair to say that we firmly believed that oral history could lend itself to advocacy and activists for those groups who had previously, whose histories had been suppressed. But we were a team that had very little power in the institution. For me personally, while I held and continue to hold privilege as a cisgender, white, middle-class individual, being a young woman at that institution with a background in social sciences was one that meant I had no power in the institution. So we began to explore oral history as a method, but we had no ethics frameworks in place. We had no processes. And this was proving to be a problem because the institution had operated so long at that point without any researchers. Marketing and communications had a lot of power. We heard comments as an example that, you know, if we did this oral history and the person signed their consent form, it would be great to have a mug made with their face on it. And I wish that had not been the case. And so we started to see how difficult it would be to challenge institutional ownership of the stories. I have substantial concerns about ethics boards at universities and ethics processes. I think they exist to an extent to protect the institution, sometimes the researcher, not necessarily the participant, but at least it is a process. And it begins that conversation around ongoing and informed consent. And also at the university, to engage in any type of research, you have to do courses, you have to take the Tri-Council course on research ethics, there's university oaths that you have to submit. There's protocols, there's proposals that need to be made. And this just was non-existent at the museum. And Heather is going to sort of share with you how we went about that. But there was also this challenge of the gaze, the tension of competing views of human rights, and the institution's continual need for feel-good stories meant that we were possibly looking at an oral history program that would create this hierarchy of suffering. And so the compromise, I think, was the Oral History, the Human Rights Champions project. And so the idea was to conduct oral histories with well-known human rights champions in Canada. And I believe that the board had quite an influence at that point. But it reified some of the critiques of human rights. It highlighted individuality. It highlighted sort of human rights as a done deal. And it led to somewhat depoliticized narratives. And there was a checklist of sorts with champions that this need for representation, with this need for a connection to legal frameworks that we as researchers often had to go through just to prove or to justify why an oral history was needed. And to be clear, this was not any one individual. This was simply the systems and the structures at place at the CMHR at that time. So I'll pause and take a breath and hand it back to Heather.
Thank you, Pauline. Hopefully the nuts and bolts of what I'm going to present isn't going to put you to sleep after Pauline's amazing content presentation. As the archivist at the time when the CMHR was exploring the idea of an oral history program, it was really my role to help contribute to the process and the framework. So I'm going to talk about the collection sort of in broad strokes and a little bit about the steps we put in place to get the program rolling. So when discussions around the oral history program began, the lead at the time, who was the head of exhibitions and research, brought me in with the insistence that the program needed an archivist. And little did I know at the time what I was getting into. I hadn't conducted any oral histories myself. My experience with them had been as a person dealing with collections with the end product. So as I said, my primary role was really to identify and develop the frameworks for the documentation of the project, things like the consent forms and deeds of gift, production data, and to help put an asset management workflow in place. We were doing this from scratch, which meant that the world was our oyster, but it also meant that we didn't have any precedent to work with, and that can be a very terrifying prospect. The program was built on the pilot of 10 interviews, which was the Champions Oral History Project that Pauline referred to. But everything that we put in place had to be scalable, with the idea that this was going to be an ongoing program that would have significant outputs and continue to contribute to exhibition development. A really important piece of this project was positioning the oral history program as the cornerstone for our collections development. So early on, the CMHR was positioned somewhat erroneously, I would say, as a non-collecting museum. It was going to be a museum of stories and ideas. So why did we need a collection? Here's a hint, don't ever say that to the archivist, because really stories and ideas are supported by archival records. Born digital collections were somehow the exception to this strange amuseological approach to things. And for some reason, the powers that be didn't have a problem with born digital collections. Now, of course, there are challenges to this because some would argue that born digital collections actually require more time and resources to management, but we'll put a pin in that for now. So the oral history program was framed as a way to establish an organic collection that would serve as a rich source of primary resources, as an opportunity for knowledge sharing, and it would shine as a premier born digital collection within a custom designed fancy schmancy digital asset management system. In laying the foundation for the program, I had the unique opportunity to contribute to the development of the collection that would ultimately be managed under my purview as the archivist. And although I was really conscious of this and did not want to influence the content of the interviews created, I was able to influence the project from a records management perspective, with the ultimate goal of creating a clean chain of custody and documentation that would lend preservation power to the collection. Creating an oral history program would address the need for developing a base collection from which we could tell these stories, and it also filled the need for exhibition content. So where exactly does one start? The first step was to determine the scope of the project, but to make sure that it was scalable. Our pilot was 10 interviews with the idea that we could repeat this on a somewhat annual basis based on resources and a budget projection. We needed to develop this budget to support the program in its first year and subsequent years, which meant looking at our startup costs and also those that would be incurred annually. Our budget needed to include the standards like travel and accommodation for our participants, but also things like training, translation, transportation of our equipment, and contract services when our team couldn't travel. Somehow the archivist got roped into the budget conversations too. I'm not really sure how that unraveled. We were really lucky to work with people like Steve High at the Concordia Center for Digital Storytelling, Nolan Riley at the University of Winnipeg Oral History Center, and we were able to identify some equipment that we would need. We wanted to be equipped for both audio only and full audio video interviews. So we purchased traveling kits with a Zoom recorder and a digital camera for our researchers to go out into the world. We also had the extraordinary privilege of having a media production team on staff. So this meant in most cases, we were able to rely on production artists to do the actual filming and recording of the interviews. Few of our research and curatorial team had done any oral history, so we embarked on a condensed training program, sort of an oral history boot camp, prior to conducting our first interviews. And last but not least, I worked with the internal IT team, who were very progressive and forward-thinking and receptive to my many wish lists for discussing digital infrastructure to ensure that we had the storage capacity, preservation ability, and processing power to ingest, process, and make accessible the terabytes of content we were going to be generating. Of course, our discussion included things like security, privacy, redundancy, backup, and in addition to the basic software and hardware needs that we would have. As an archivist, I have to say good records make useful and usable collections, and I can't repeat that enough. So document, 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 and Armando can probably attest to the fact that I was always after people to fill out the proper paperwork. As archivists, we are notorious for embodying the barefoot cobbler's kids. But as we built this program, we wanted to ensure its longevity, even if the program's founding members eventually were not around to facilitate. One of the documents that we developed prior to the program launch was the terms of reference that documented not only the spirit of the program and its intent, but outlined our roles and responsibilities. This was an evergreen document in the first year or so, but creating the document helped the team buy in and was one of those documents that we really referred to regularly. As an archivist, I ended up being responsible for creating the documentation workflow, but also for articulating a preservation plan, a description framework, and a plan for access. We wanted to ensure that our participants were protected, as was their content. There were long discussions on whether we would provide access online or strictly offline, and how we could best incorporate content into exhibits without losing the context of the whole life history approach that we were using in our interviews. One of the most important documents that we developed to assist this process was our informed consent agreement. So when we started out, we had a 3-page document, and I'm going to show you some screenshots from this document. It had multiple checkboxes, and it was a document based on a process developed by Concordia that we adopted for our project with their permission. We had initially opted for this approach because it incorporated the shared authority philosophy and provided options for our participants to have full control over their content. This also gave us a way to get out of the, hey, why can't we just put a picture on a mug pressure from the communications office. As you can see from some of the comments on the side, when it came time to review the form a year or so into the program, operationally, we found a few holes with it. So after we were in operation for a little bit, had conducted the pilot program and had started operationalizing the oral history program, we determined that the consent form did have a few issues, and we implemented a fairly rigorous review process to take a look at that. So here's a screenshot of the check boxes, and as you can see, we've got columns for yes or no, and I agree, lots of options for anonymity. And one of the challenges that came up was that we would have people fill out these forms and check both yes and no, which of course does not give us clear direction in how to manage the content afterwards. So we would find ourselves going back to participants to clarify whether they actually did agree to participate or did not agree to participate, whether they agreed to be photographed or not, and whether they could have open access or not, and whether they wanted anonymity, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly this form was just too complicated. So the lesson here is try to keep it simple and try to keep it clear. I'd like to say categorically that this complex form came from a place of very good intentions, but it wasn't really helpful to us if it wasn't filled out properly. In the final page of our initial documentation, when we got into the release of materials, when we had a copyright advisor go over this with us, we discovered we were really in the weeds in terms of keeping up with copyright legislation that we as a Crown Corporation were subject to. So we were trying to make assertions that were not really supported by copyright legislation. This is where we were trying to really codify shared authority and allow participants to do with their story what they wished. But of course, Canadian copyright won't allow that. And just a little side note here, this is where my journey into copyright and intellectual property truly began. And it was yet another nerdy rabbit hole for me to dive into head first. So we didn't want to take stories from their rightful owners, and we were trying to articulate that in our consent forms. But the way our copyright legislation works here in Canada doesn't really allow us for us to do it in the way we were trying to in these consent forms. So the agreement ended up being unclear and wasn't legally executable. So you'll notice in the second paragraph talking about copyright being held by CMHR, which is correct. But because of that, it wouldn't restrict the participants' use of the recorded interviews, which is actually incorrect. Copyright legislation does in fact restrict their use because the museum held copyright. So needless to say, it was problematic. After the review, what resulted was a single-page document, which was much more clear and sort of laid out what we were trying to do. So we tried to make it clear, concise, and address the basics of what, how, and why. And the result of this intensive review of the 3-pager we initially started out with ended up with this single-page document. So try to break it down so you can see what we were up to here. The introduction was reduced from sort of half a page to 2 short paragraphs, and the final sentence of that introduction tried to very much distill what we wanted to do. We wanted to record the interview, we wanted to preserve it, and we wanted to share the stories that our participants were sharing with us through the interview. Then the second paragraph focused on how we would actually use the content. So we talked about what museums do in general. And then again, we articulated that we wanted to record the interview, we wanted to preserve it in our collections, and we wanted to use your interview for things like exhibitions, publications, and programming. And then we also talked a little bit about what we would typically do with the interview and what sort of transformations or byproducts that might include. So that would be things like transcription and translations, reproducing it in part or in whole to make it accessible. And that primarily we wanted to make it accessible for research and private study, but it might also be used for educational purposes or promotion. That was a bit of a compromise for us because we wanted to be very careful about how materials might be used for promotion. We also went into a little bit more detail about what that might look like, and including the fact that interviews and related materials might be displayed, distributed, or published by the museum on the internet was really an important piece for us to include, because that was sort of buried in the 3-pager before. And I think a lot of people maybe didn't realize that their content might have been made available online. And the final piece is the release material. So that's where you get into the legal nitty-gritty of the signing off on the oral history. The compromise for the museum was to include the statement that the CMHR holds all copyright, but basically it's because what the law tells us we have to do. So in my opinion, it's still not a great way to do shared authority, but this is where things stand right now. And you can see that the current form also indicates that story holders have to ask for permission to use their own stories in a public manner. I'm not sure if this will evolve or if the museum will operate status quo on this one, but I think there's still some room for improvement. One of the things that Pauline touched upon was sort of managing the expectations of everybody that is participating in and contributing to the oral history program. And at the museum, that program had many voices, often competing to be heard. So we had the board, the executive, the communications and marketing team, the researchers, the collections team, and of course, the participants. All of the expectations needed to be managed and competing priorities balanced with ethical approaches. The initial list of interviewees suggested to us by those outside the curatorial team left something to be desired in terms of balance, and that's something that Pauline referred to earlier. And as the person responsible as the archivist and then head of collections for managing the resulting oral history collection, one of the things we had to really carefully review and weigh was the expectations of the participants, how their stories would be preserved, described, and accessed, with those of the institution, which was usually more, and instant total access. This weighs heavily on me even now, as I've left the museum almost 3 years ago, as I know that there's not been an archivist employed by the museum since 2016. And my former position as head of collections has not been filled. So one can't help but wonder, how can the expectations of a properly managed digital collection be met under those conditions? As I'm sure you're all aware, oral history creates many products, and even managing them from creation can be chaotic. Our particular project and the resulting program created a mix of paper and digital products that included, but was not limited to, wet ink signed consent forms and PDF scans of those, field notes in both digital and paper format, preparatory research in both digital and paper, transcriptions that came to us digitally in a multiple formats as we explored how best to get these things transcribed, and audio video files that included master footage, B-roll, photos, and edits. There was terabytes, even in the early days, of audio-visual files. And of course, ephemera, because people want to give you their stuff. No matter how many things you put in place to prevent you from people giving you their stuff, most of the time, you're going to leave an oral history with stuff. So, complicated collecting. Here's where I had to throw in my meme, because as Disney Aladdin says, you know, as the genie, you have phenomenal cosmic power and itty-bitty living space. Well, we had access to this amazing program, and we were doing these amazing interviews, meeting some fabulous people, but we really had limited frameworks within which we could manage all of the different products. So things that were always on my mind as the archivist and head of collections were preservation. We had multiple formats, different preservation requirements, and really big storage requirements. Access, which records are you able to provide access to, and what are the conditions for access? Managing the digital assets themselves. Store once, reference often was a mantra we heard all the time, but I'm not sure anybody actually understood the implications of that mantra. And accessibility. As a human rights museum, we couldn't provide content in a manner that wasn't accessible. So we had to think about transcripts, translation, ESL, inclusive design, and software challenges. I don't know if any of you have explored the accessibility within your own collections description software or digital asset management platforms or your presentation platforms, but many of them aren't very accessible. And finally, ethical use. How would we use these intensely personal and powerful interviews? How could we incorporate shared authority when we are handcuffed by copyright legislation? And what are the ethics of not using these collections? And back to managing expectations. So we spoke a lot about building the program and managing the product there, but a lot of us are probably dealing with historical collections, and these are the things we inherit. I don't think very many of us have had the opportunity to deal with building new collections, but instead we've inherited the legacies of archivists and curators and collectors before us. Historical collections in general have many challenges, especially in the context of systemic colonial structures that our professions operate within. Oral history collections in particular can pose additional challenges. The interview, field recording, or oral history was often taken from a community rather than created in a collaborative context. That isn't to say that there aren't any examples of recordings created in an ethical manner, but many of us will have recordings that, when examined through a more critical lens, are likely very problematic. From the simple multitude of technology, migration, preservation, and access complexities that arise from obsolete technologies, lack of working playback equipment, or technicians to maintain equipment if we're lucky enough to have it, early digital formats that may not be properly migrated, to hardware and software to access these materials, to the more complex concerns over the consent process. Are there consent forms for your existing collections? Are they clear? Are the participants still living so that conditions can be clarified if they're not clear? Are the consent forms themselves in clear language, or were they signed under duress or misinformation, misunderstanding, even if that duress is implied through the power imbalances. Was this content taken or willingly shared? And issues of data sovereignty arrive when we look at the metadata that was created around these collections. Think of current efforts in reparative description and cataloging. We need to take action to manage bad metadata, harmful language, and misinformation in our collections, and we need to work with communities to restore their control, ownership, and authority over their own content, knowledge, and data. And we also need to think about how we're using these collections, not only directly as primary sources, but the research produced as a result of working with these primary sources.
And so what does this all mean? Thank you, Heather, for providing that really important overview. And I think also providing a different perspective that I think at times I also didn't see when I was at the museum and working in a researcher and in a curator. And I say both of those terms because the institution couldn't decide what we were, but it was a different perspective that we didn't always see. And so what does this mean for moving forward with oral history? I think it's really important to ask, what does shared authority look like? What can it look like? And what are the practicalities of it? There may be times, and I mentioned this earlier, that shared authority is not the right approach and highly politicized, or in situations where there's a lot of harmful myths and stereotypes. And so shared authority might look very different in those contexts. But the privileging, and rightly so, of lived and living experience is crucial. And in hindsight, you know, they say hindsight is 2020. I'm not sure I would have done oral history the same way at the museum. There was a push for us to collect a lot of interviews, in part because we needed then the resources to further the program, but also to show our own importance and the importance of oral history and research to the institution. And so numbers became evidence of success. But this begs the question, should oral histories continue when collections are already languishing in archives with little attention to what's needed to maintain their integrity, or to develop means of access, to develop appropriate finding aids, not because staff are careless, but simply because there aren't the resources or the institutional will to do so. And if interviews already exist on the subject, can you justify why more interviews are needed? What will they add to your project? And can you as a researcher and can the institution care for the interviews that have already been done? And so if you cannot care for those interviews, then what should we do with them? Do they return to the participant? Informed consent and the ongoing nature of a consent process, and this idea of axiology would mean that we might need to be a little bit more creative as researchers and as curators. And maybe it's that we listen to participants and support the creation of counter archives in the absence of an institutional archive. And so I think with that, I would say that if you as the curator do not have the trust of your institution, and if you do not trust the institution, if you do not have the resources, the time, or the freedom to work in a good way and in a responsible way with communities, then it's just really important to ask that question, should you be working with individuals and doing oral histories?
And I think, Pauline, that those are really good points. I'd like to wrap up sort of what does this all mean with a little bit of an example of what it could be and what it could look like. We were really lucky to work with a fabulous copyright advisor at the Canadian Museum for History when we were doing our revisions of our consent forms. And she graciously allowed me to share an anonymized version of one of their consent forms. So she was working with Indigenous community over an oral history project. And what I'm sharing here, I've removed the community's names just to protect their privacy. But basically, it's broken down in three areas: the rights and privileges, access, and review. And in the rights and privileges, it recognizes that the Canadian Museum of History holds the copyright. So because Canadian copyright law, that's how the copyright would be designated. If they're recording the oral history, then they own the copyright. But they're granting the right to the originating community to take that content and reproduce it and share it as they want to, as a community, and with educational institutions across Canada. So they're sharing the knowledge back with the community. And in fact, the agreement goes on to say, that basically they're conducting these oral histories for the purposes of research, private study, and education. And if a third party comes along and wants to access that content for any other purpose, that they need to get permission from not only the copyright holder, the museum, but they also have to contact the community and get permission from the tradition bearers of the story. And even using that language, tradition bearer, I think is starting to recognize different ways of doing these agreements, and that the permission has to come from the community through their traditional methods of granting permission. And finally, they're committing to keeping the relationship going and encouraging collaborations by identifying this as a living document, and that any changes to it have to be agreed to by both parties. So that was shared by the permission of Tanya Anderson, and she's now the advisor of intangible cultural heritage at the CMH. And she has also agreed that I could share her contact information if anybody is looking for some assistance. As we begin to wrap up, we want to let you know that you're not alone. We're going to do some screenshot sharing of some of the resources that we rely on. We're going to zip through them really fast so we can get to your questions, but Pauline and I are going to create a more formal PDF document that we can share with the group afterwards. So don't worry about madly taking notes. This is just sort of, I don't know, it might be a top 10 of things that we like and that we use. So earlier on in the presentation, Pauline referred to Working in Good Ways, which is a result of a lot of work done by the Community Engaged Learning Group here at the University of Manitoba, done with community, some fabulous resources available free of charge for download, and also you can purchase a hard copy. Canada doesn't have legislation regarding repatriation yet, but in the US, NAGPRA, or the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, is an excellent resource for information about what repatriation is all about and how to get started. In terms of traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, and intellectual property, again, the Canadian copyright isn't really equipped to deal with that yet, but WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, is starting to pick away at it. It's still fairly institutional in their approach, but there is some information there that can help you get started. Pauline and I are both guided by UNDRIP, or the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's quite a lengthy document, but if you remember nothing else, remember Article 31, which is Indigenous people have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. Oral History in the Digital Age, brought to you by Doug Boyd and the Louis Nunby Oral History group. Has a lot of resources on best practice, technology to use. They've got a great oral history digital platform that allows you to present transcriptions side by side with your oral histories. And if you're looking at starting to break down the barriers in your metadata and your collection's descriptions, I highly recommend the group at Local Contexts. They have two systems. Local Context traditional labels, which you can work with community to put traditional labels on your materials. And as well, they've got notices that indicate to the world that you're willing to collaborate and acknowledges that you've got some descriptions that are not quite complete. And so that sort of wraps up the formal part of our presentation.